Okay, it's 12 noon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. Before we get started, just a reminder to please enter your questions in the chat at the end of the presentation, and please answer a brief survey that will be emailed out to you after the presentation. This will let us know that you were present today. Our Medical Grand Rounds today are courtesy of the Division of Rheumatology, and we have with us Dr. Elizabeth Hazel, who is an Associate Professor of Medicine in the Department of Internal Medicine, Division of Rheumatology at McGill. She's the Interim Division Director of Rheumatology at the MUHC. She is the Director of the Young Adult Rheumatic Disease Clinic and is the Consulting Rheumatologist to the Lethbridge-Leighton-Mackay Rehab Centre. She was awarded the McGill Clinical Innovation Award in 2018 for her work in establishing for her work in establishing a multidisciplinary transition program. She's also passionate about medical education. She was the program director of adult rheumatology for the past 9 years and has seen the program through 2 successful Royal College accreditation cycles and the implementation of the new competency by design curriculum. She was named the prestigious Faculty Honor Roll in 2022 for her work in this domain. Dr. Hazel is currently serving as Vice Chair of the CRA Education Committee, as well as serving as the Royal College Accreditation and Exam Boards. She started the new role of Assistant Dean of PGME, CMBE in December. And as you said, Beth, you have a lot of jobs.
Too many jobs.
So congratulations. There's a lot of jobs. And you told me just before that you're doing a master's in health leadership at the Des Hotels School at McGill, and that this is your thesis, or as you're preparing your final semester, I guess, at the Des Hotels School, this is what you're preparing as part of your thesis. So we look forward to having you share that with us. Thanks for being here today, Beth.
Yeah, so it's a non-thesis master's, but yeah, I'm going to give you guys a taste of some of the work that I put into my final paper. So we'll get going. So the topic of today's talk is nothing to do with rheumatology, but it's on physician and pharmaceutical industry relations. And the subtitle I put there, can medical education help us to rebalance the important partnerships between industry and doctors? So my master's supervisor, Dr. Luciano Baron-Cruz, is he works at both Haute Études Commerciales, HSC, and McGill in the business schools. And he helped me a lot in understanding about the business side of medicine. And I hope to share some of that with you today. So I'm going to start with a disclosure slide, and you see there I'm going to talk a little bit more about disclosure slides later. But I think the most important thing here is that I did receive a tiny bit of funding from Department of Medicine and from a Royal College grant to offset the cost of my international master's in health leadership degree. So the objectives of this talk you guys saw on the poster was a little bit of a historical visit into physician-pharma relations to understand the challenges of this relationship and to apply something called an impact gap canvas to solution mapping. When you see the title of this talk, what physicians tend to think about is ethical dilemmas. They think about the uncomfortableness of this relationship. But what I really want to emphasize today is that there will be no shaming. I don't want to talk about physicians being good and industry being bad. I really want to talk about what's brought us to the place we are now and how we can make it better in the future. So the impact gap canvas is a tool that's used in business problem analysis. It was designed by a Dr. Peppy Thornton, and it can be used by anyone who wants to understand the landscape of a problem and possibly identify some paths on how they might find a solution. So it slows us down from thinking we know a problem and just jumping to a solution, and it really makes us examine where we are, what's happening, what brought us to that place, and what solutions have already been tried, and then to really see how we can close the gap and solve the problem. So when I started thinking about the issue of physician-pharma relations, I sort of divided it into the goals of industry versus the goals of physicians. And I think it's pretty clear that industry, they answer to their shareholders and their goal is profitability. I don't think that's good. I don't think that's bad. I think that's what we live in a capitalist society. Physicians are supposed to promote the interests of their patients. They have an additional societal responsibility. But on the same side, we are dependent on pharma funding for a lot of our activities, for research, for conferences, for continuing professional education activities. And I don't think you can be a physician in 2023 and not feel at least some tension around this topic. But I think that what we have to remember is that we have a shared interest, both industry and physicians, in developing medications to address health issues of the population. And it's a relationship that can't be separated in the advances in medical knowledge. So how do each of these groups achieve their goals? Well, industry is out there to expand the market for their product. They want to create brand loyalty, they need partners in lobbying, and their goal is really to sell their drug for the most profit. Physicians should be looking at the best outcomes for their patients. So what are the pros and cons of giving therapy? Are there non-pharmacological approaches? So it's more than just getting out the prescription pad every time we see a patient. And how we really achieve those things. So industry, what I'm talking about in those points is marketing. And physicians, really, it's continuing education or medical education. So this is kind of the landscape today. This is the kind of issue that I had focused on. But I wanted to go back into the history of medicine to understand when this started, how it evolved, and how we got to where we are. So I'm going to go way back in time. We're going to start with Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. And we probably think of medicine in a linear time path. Today we live, happy, healthy, productively into our 80s. And we probably think that this is a linear thing from Hippocrates' time, but it's really been a start-stop in the history of medicine. And what I think we have to really understand is that the role of the physician in Greek times was extremely different from the doctor today, especially in terms of medical therapies. The picture I have here, the hepatic corpus, it actually underlied the tradition of self-help. It instructed people how they could eat better, exercise, do things that would actually rebalance their health. And that reflected the pathophysiology of disease that dominated ancient Greek thinking. They really thought that illness was an imbalance of the humors and the bodily fluids. So bile and phlegm, if they got out of whack, then they would cause illness. And so the treatment obviously was to restore that balance. And there was very little talk about pharmacologic or medical treatment of illness. If we jump way ahead from there to medieval times, probably a dark phase in medical history, if you think about living at that time, being a citizen in the 1350s, it was not a good time to be sick. Medieval doctors didn't have a clue really what caused disease. Religion still played a very big role in people thought getting sick or who got better. The life expectancy at that time was maybe 35 years old, and that was if you were lucky enough to survive early childhood. Infant mortality was extremely high. Maybe 20% of children died before their first birthday. Many women died in childbirth. But one of the things that really affected the history of medicine during this time was that religious practices were really quite ineffective in preventing plague and preventing the massive deaths from plague. And that served to really curb the power of the church and raise the influence of the doctor. But who was that doctor at this time? Well, it was someone who could maybe make some diagnoses and maybe prognosticate on what might happen, but really didn't have a lot of an armamentarium in prescribing therapies. So if I move ahead to a brighter time in medicine, to the Renaissance, I want you to think about what you think was the most important invention in the history of medicine in the Renaissance. And I'll tell you what I think it was, and it's probably not what you expect. I think it was the printing press. And we may not think of that as a medical invention, but it was this invention that really allowed the dissemination of information around the world. So learners could access ancient texts. The ability to read about new advances in medicine led to a transformation in the scientific method. And that again contributed to the decline in the influence of the Catholic Church. This was the beginning of evidence-based medicine, right? Until we didn't, before we had scientific knowledge at our fingertips, we couldn't practice that kind of medicine. Some of the really important things that came up in that time, the work of William Harvey on the circulation of blood, really stopped us from thinking about the pathophysiology of disease as humoral, and really enforced a more mechanistic or mechanical pathophysiology of disease. And the other defining moment in the field of anatomy was Vesalius's De Humani Corpus Fabrica, the textbook of anatomy. And again, once there was a better understanding of human physiology, doctors really started to think of the pathophysiology of disease in a more mechanistic way. But again, in the Renaissance, there wasn't a big armamentarium of medications that doctors were prescribing. Most of the treatments were locally grown herbs, and it wasn't the doctor that was dispensing. They would give advice, and sometimes it was more the local apothecaries that were the ones that were dispensing medication. In that 1700s, 18th century, the apothecary shop really was a bit more like the family doctor. A patient would go to the apothecary and talk about some symptoms, and they might determine what the best therapy was. And with the general population having rising rates of literacy and urbanization, there was the beginning of a medical marketplace as well. Again, most of the treatments at the time were locally produced pills, potions, and nostrums that the apothecary might be famous for. But there was a little bit more cultural exchange between Eastern and Western countries, and there was a trade in exotic spices. And there were the beginning of a few therapies like chinchoa bark, for fevers, or sarsaparilla for gout. But again, most of the medical practice at that time was local herbs prescribed by apothecaries. The medical marketplace was really completely unregulated in this time. It was really buyer beware. All different kinds of healers could peddle their homemade potions, and doctors were included in that too. They would make up a tonic or a potion and advertise it in bills like this one. Now, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children's teething actually contained morphine, and children died from this, but there weren't regulatory practices at the time. So if we move ahead even further, the first successful pharmaceutical product was aspirin. And if you guys like medical literature, I highly recommend this book that tells the really interesting story of the development of aspirin. And just to summarize very quickly, a group of German chemists, Wilhelm von Hofmann, Eichhorn, and Dressler, they were some of the first pioneers in the science of organic chemistry, and they built on some of the science that had been found, willow tree bark extract and other anti-inflammatory products. And they refined ASA aspirin and launched that in July 1899. They actually could be credited for the first brand name marketing. They called their aspirin antifibrin. And Bayer, which was the company that was the product, they were the first pharmaceutical company to make a product that was in-house development, and it was invented and marketed solely for the intention of making money, and treating people. But it was the first designed and implemented drug. Interestingly, when they first started marketing, they sent out little packages of aspirin to doctors across Europe. So you could also credit them with the first drug samples being distributed. And they asked doctors for their feedback, how it worked on their different patients. So you could even say that they performed the first phase 4 trial. If we move ahead, the first blockbuster drugs. Now, what's a blockbuster drug? That's a drug that grosses $1 billion a year. Because up until the first blockbuster drugs, medications that came on the market were really filling important niches, vaccines, antibiotics, that kind of thing. But the first blockbuster drug was cimetidine under the brand name Tagamet. It was an anti-ulcer drug. It was launched in 1976 by Smith, Kline, and French with an aggressive marketing campaign. You can even see from the packaging that it's bright and exciting. And when you have a successful drug, that's when you start to have Me Too drugs, or drugs that do the same thing in a slightly different way. And Glaxo developed a competitor product to cimetidine in 1981, ranitidine or Zantac. And they were the first ones to pitch their product directly to doctors. So they hired a massive sales force, and instead of promoting the benefits of ranitidine, they actually focused on the minor side effects of Tagamet. And by 1987, they were outselling Tagamet 3-to-1. For both companies, the profits were in the tens of billions of dollars, but it really set the stage for the importance of direct-to-physician marketing strategies. Now, I'm going to say something now that you're going to hear me say again. All the money that is spent by the pharmaceutical industry to market their products, if they continue to do it, it's because it works. And this is just the first example of knowing that aggressive direct-to-physician marketing really, really works to sell a product. So I'm going to end that little historical tour thinking about where we are now. And what I really wanted to highlight here is how very, very new this physician-pharma relationship is. We went through the whole history of medicine, the whole history of medical education, and it's really the last 50 years that we have medications that are being aggressively marketed for money. At the same time, it's a really great time to be sick. We have so many amazing medications. And coming from the field of rheumatology, I think it's dramatic, it's drastic. This is the artist, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and you can see his hands there just completely destroyed by his rheumatoid arthritis. The treatment he had in the day were these sort of braces that helped him hold a paintbrush. Just imagine the art that he could have created with if he'd have been treated with the biologics that we have access to today. So let's move on to marketing. So while throughout history, medical education focused on the evolving science and evidence-based medicine, especially over the last 50 years, pharmaceutical companies have focused on marketing. They've focused on the very best ways to market their products. And they borrowed a lot from other marketing companies. And Coca-Cola is probably most famous for having slick and successful marketing strategies. And when we look at this ad, we think about Coke, but we don't see ethical dilemmas. We know we're being marketed to. And Coke does this very well. You can talk about the 7 Ps of marketing, and they do all of it well. They have a product that people really think they need. Now, you could argue that if you're thirsty, you should drink water, not Coke, but they found a recipe, they found a product that people really enjoy. They price it at the right level so that it's expensive enough that they have a good profit margin, but that that you'll keep buying it. And their promotion spans all different marketing techniques, from associating the brand with sporting events to good times, like this ad. Even the shape of their bottle produces brand loyalty and things like that. So when I talk about all this, I'm saying that when we see an ad for Coke, we know we're being marketed to. But pharma can't market directly to consumers the same way as Coke can. Direct-to-consumer prescription drug advertising has actually been banned in most industrialized countries since the 1940s. In countries with national health insurance, like Canada, this is a strategy that's used to keep healthcare costs down, because it's clear that advertising campaigns really work. And to give you an example of that, in 2020, pharmaceutical companies spent more than $6 billion on direct-to-consumer advertising in the United States. And like I said, they would not be spending that money if it didn't work. So a study comparing Canadian patients where ads are banned and American patients where print ads have been allowed since the early 1980s and TV ads have been allowed since 1997, they found that direct-to-consumer advertising, the patients exposed, they were more likely to think they needed medical therapy. They were more likely to ask their doctor for that medical therapy, and their doctor was more likely to prescribe it, even if the patient didn't fulfill criteria for that drug. I put this little picture here, just a screenshot off TSN, to say that even though in Canada there is no direct-to-consumer advertising, you can see that there are sneaky ways that drug companies can show their brand and advertise on our TV stations. So what else can they do when they don't have access to the consumer market? Well, one thing they do are celebrity endorsements. They get their medications mentioned on medical drama TV shows. They promote individual patients through public relation firms. They get journalists to write articles about health issues. So there are some ways they can do it indirectly that way. Another interesting thing where, again, we might not think of this as marketing is their sponsorship of health information websites. And I want to give you an example. In 2010, Eli Lilly, who was manufacturing the antidepressant duloxetine, launched a self-assessment quiz on the website WebMD. Now, they declared that they were sponsoring this quiz, but their 10-question quiz was formulated so that even if a person answered every question as a healthy, non-depressed person would, the final click, the final conclusion would say, lower risk, you may be at risk for major depression. And it actually took pressure from a US senator to get them to take down that quiz, which was likely sending people to their physicians worried they had depression. And it brings us to one marketing technique that's used, and it's really to try and increase the number of patients that fit or that could be prescribed that medication. And along those lines, I called it increasing the medicalization of normal symptoms. So like I said, widening the market is one of the things that pharmaceutical companies will do to increase profits. An example of this is social anxiety disorder. So back to Hippocrates, he even described patients with something that would fit the constellation of symptoms that we would call social anxiety disorder. But in the 1980s, a study showed that the prevalence was about 1 to 2% of the general population. In 2002, GSK, who marketed a drug that could treat social anxiety disorder, they launched a $90 million advertising campaign. And shortly after, surveys showed that the prevalence of social anxiety disorder was around 12%. So it went from 1% to 12%. So what's going on? Is it possible that these disease awareness campaigns are helping to bring under-recognized issues into the public concourse? Well, possibly, but it's also a risk that we're making perfectly normal people feel sick or feel inadequate. And with that, we risk exposing healthy people to medication side effects. So even though we don't think of this as pure Coca-Cola-like medical marketing, it's a very effective strategy to sell medications. And the final direct-to-consumer advertising that's used is when pharmaceutical companies support or sponsor patient groups. So again, patient support groups are vitally important in facilitating peer support, especially for rare diseases. They can disseminate information, assist in fundraising, lobbying on behalf of these patients. And pharmaceutical companies definitely benefit from this relationship. They benefit by being seen as generous and socially responsible. And they also get loyalty from these advocacy groups. One study by Health Action International showed that patient support groups that get funding from industry, they are much more likely to have an effect on their lobbying patterns, with them being much more likely to ask for approval of a drug and much less likely to criticize rising drug prices. To give you an idea, a study in 2010 showed that pharmaceutical company funding for these groups represented about half of the running costs of these organizations. So they're incredibly dependent on this funding. Now, if we move to direct-to-physician advertising, if you ask someone on the street what that meant, they would probably think of something like this image: doctors being sent to some sunny destination to go to a conference. And maybe this did happen a little bit more in the 80s and 90s. But I wanted to talk about the very first research paper to come out to look at the impact of these kind of large gifts to physicians was only in 1992. And it was actually a really interesting study. They took doctors who prescribed an intravenous medication that could only be given in hospital. And they did a nice controlled trial, and they where half of the physicians were offered all expense paid trips to a Sun Belt destination. And they tracked the pharmacy inventory usage for the drugs before and after they attended the symposia in these destinations. And not surprisingly, the usage patterns reflected a massive increase in prescribing. So drug A, the mean went from 81 to 272 units, for example. But the thing that I found even more interesting is that they surveyed the physicians involved, both before and after, and none of them, or they did not think that their prescribing had changed, and before they went, they didn't think that they would be influenced, that their prescription writing would change, and even after their prescription writing had changed, they didn't think it had been influenced. And this is something that you see time and time again in this literature, is that physicians really think that they are immune to the powers of marketing, and we really aren't. Now, what about that $20 lunch? What about if a company has left an extra box in your secretary's office. Well, it's actually not much better. A $20 lunch has been shown to change prescribing habits for up to 2 years after it's accepted. And that goes to the human nature of gift giving or gift receiving. Along those lines, an interesting marketing technique is samples. So studies have consistently shown that drug samples influence prescribing choices and at all different levels. So there was one randomized trial that looked at resident doctor prescribing habits, and it showed that having access to samples in an outpatient clinic influenced their prescription habits at that time, but then for years in the future. And what we should know about these drug samples is that they're not just any drug. So pharmaceutical companies will provide samples of the newer medications, which are probably more expensive. And when patients are given a sample of a medication, they're usually given the prescription as well. So they're going to keep on taking it. It's not like they're just getting free drug. What's interesting is the psychological impact. So just like we are influenced by receiving gifts from pharma, we kind of like being nice to our patients. We kind of like giving gifts to our patients. And sometimes that act of giving a patient a free sample will have the double effect of increasing loyalty to that company of the doctor. So I want to change things around a little bit and play a little game. So I've been making you think about your habits as a doctor. Now I want to think about how you would be as a marketer. So what strategies would you use to increase different kinds of prescription prescribing? How would you nudge your colleagues to prescribe a drug? And I thought what would be kind of fun here is to talk about physicians the way that some drug companies have had trainings for their reps on how to categorize different physicians into different categories and then how to act on them. So these descriptions are based on a whistleblower from Eli Lilly, who testified at a U.S. court hearing. And he produced a table of all the different kinds of physicians and the best ways to market to them. So we'll play this little game. I'll tell you about the physician and you think about how you would get around the issues or make this physician market. And I'll tell you about what this whistleblower said. There are obviously other ways of marketing. So the first doctor he mentioned was the acquiescent doctor. So the rep comes into the office or sees this physician, and the physician just agrees with everything he says, thinking that this is going to be a way to get the drug up out of the office as quickly as possible. So what the whistleblower said here is that this person is actually pretty easy to manipulate. They're taught to derive commitments from doctors. And if you commit, even if you say you're committing just to get them out of your office, it actually influences behavior. So the drug rep will build a case to increase usage. Gifts are used to enhance guilt and social pressure. And the other thing he said around this is that I found interesting. He said, doctors think they're immune, and this is an illusion that drug companies try to maintain. So if you ever hear someone saying something to you like, oh, I know that, having this lunch won't make a difference to your prescribing, they're trying to make you think that you're stronger than the marketing is. Another kind of physician, they called them the thought leader. This is a high prescriber, and you know that these companies all have all of your prescription statistics. Someone that's friendly and well-liked by colleagues. And what he said was that reps are taught to groom certain doctors for speaking circuits. They watch for signs of brand loyalty. They watch for signs of allegiance. If they do give a talk, they look at how they answer and field questions. And speakers with charisma, credentials, and aura of integrity, they're often elevated to national programs. And what it is, it's not necessarily the leader in the domain. It's someone who has those characteristics. So if you're being approached and asked to be a thought leader, if you're being approached and asked to give talks, it's not necessarily, it is a marketing technique as well as maybe being a complement to your style. Well, what about the opposite, the aloof and skeptical doctor, the doctor who, doesn't want to hear about the marketing, just says that they only practice evidence-based medicine. So again, the whistleblower here said that this is an easy person to manipulate. All he had to do was visit the office armed with journal articles that specifically counter the shortcomings. And then he said the best way to get this physician thinking the way he wanted him to think was to play dumb and ask the doctor to explain the paper to him. So if you're being asked to explain a paper to a drug rep, just think about whether you're being manipulated. And finally, the people in the room here that say, well, this isn't me because I don't see drug reps. I'm the no see, no time doctor. That you may still be a target of marketing. So what can happen is that sometimes drug reps get even more marketing success by getting to the staff, getting to the nurses, getting to the admin staff. These people can tell them information about the doctors. They can give them critical information that could be maybe used for a brief hallway talk. But it also encourages the staff to discuss the drug unfiltered with the MDs. So again, statistics have shown that if companies get in even to see staff, the prescribing habits of the doctors on the team changes. So I want to go back to that impact gap canvas just to say where we are right now. So in terms of the challenge mapping, what I hope I've given you a taste of is that pharma marketing has an undue influence on physician practice, and that this is a relatively new phenomenon. Now, in this brief talk, I didn't have a chance to talk about all sorts of other kinds of marketing. I didn't talk about print ads in journals. I didn't talk about conference sponsorships, pharma-sponsored CPD development, ghostwriting papers. There's all sorts of things that I didn't have a chance to get to. But I do want to start talking a little bit about what solutions have already been proposed and where we are. So in terms of solutions, industry has actually taken it upon themselves to do some self-regulation. And that's in the interest of the pharmaceutical companies for many reasons. First, it's important to have a positive public perception, but it's also important that they're on an even playing field with their competitors. You can't have one company, taking doctors to Caribbean destinations and then others, taking them to McDonald's for lunch, right? So pharmaceutical companies in Canada joined forces to develop this Innovative Medicines Canada, or IMC. It currently is composed of 44 member pharmaceutical companies, and they're bound by a code of ethical practices. And that includes standards for working with healthcare professionals, prohibition on certain kinds of entertainment, recreation, social activities, some limits on the costs of lodging, meals, and beverages. And it addresses the roles in continuing education, saying that these kind of presentations should be balanced and things like that. Now, on their website, it says that people self-report, or violations of this is obtained by self-report, and that violators can be fined $10,000, and that any violators would be published on the website. So I searched hard. There are no violators that are published on the website. And I contacted the host, and I did not get a response on if anyone has ever been fined for breaking these rules. But they are there and they do exist. And if you see this Innovative Medicine Canada logo, you can know that it's a company that adheres to that. The other logo you might see is this PAAB logo. This is to regulate advertising in Canada. And if you see this logo on a print ad, it means that it has been by a company that has expressed voluntarily to adhere to a code of ethical practices in advertising. Again, it's voluntary, and there don't seem to be penalties for infractions. But it's supposed to be something that can help us as physicians know whether what we're reading in an ad is reliable. So if industry self-regulation isn't enough, what have physicians done to self-regulate? Now, I said in my second slide, the disclosure slide, that I would come back to this. When we are submitting research for publication or giving lectures like this one today, we're asked to disclose our potential conflicts of interest. And most journals and organizations have some kind of standardized template, but there are huge differences in the scope and time frame of the potential conflicts of interest. And for the disclosure slide, the requirements about that slide differ widely. And one really interesting study looked at the use of disclosure slides at a medical conference, and it found that it was really not a useful thing. Most of the slides, the conflict of interest statement was either missing, it was displayed just way too briefly for anyone to read, or it just wasn't explained by the presenter. And worse, the things that were mentioned on the disclosure slide were often discordant with statements on the corresponding written formats of the presentations. So the authors of that study concluded that the disclosure slide really didn't help the audience to adequately assess the objectivity of the presenter for the talk. So we need to do better with those disclosure slides. Along the same lines, journal conflict of interest declarations should be standardized so that we know exactly what we're getting into there. And guidelines are so important in determining how patients are treated, that guideline committee members are another group that where conflict of interest should be declared. So if industry and the physicians aren't doing a good enough job at regulating this, maybe we need government regulation. In the States, you may have heard of the Sunshine Act, or the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, which was passed in 2010. It makes financial relationships between pharmaceutical manufacturers and physicians more transparent. But the first reports that came out in 2013 showed that there had been really little impact on prescribing habits or the pharmaceutical industry. In Canada, we don't have any of these things. There was an attempt in 2017 in Ontario to pass an act that was similar to the Sunshine Act, but it was shelved by a subsequent provincial government, and there isn't anything similar in other provinces. So what about med schools? What about universities? Well, all but one of the medical schools in Canada has some kind of industry relations policy. Ours that I've listed here came out in 2011. And it's very good. It's all evidence-based, and it makes a lot of really important points about limiting some of the marketing practices that are most important. So I talked about pharmaceutical samples. Our policy does ban individual physicians from having pharmaceutical samples. I talked about industry sponsoring travel to conferences. Our policy does ban that. Our policy does ban pharma reps visiting clinical sites without an appointment. So it is a good policy. I think not enough of us know about it, and I don't think it's well adhered to for the most part, and there is no penalty for breaking the policy. So if I return to my impact gap canvas here, the solutions mapping There's some self-regulation by industry, physicians, and medical schools, but I don't think it's managed to close the gap on the issue here. So I think that one of the things that we need to think about is improved, enhanced education for physicians at all stages, not just our trainees, but people in practice as well, to understand this issue, to not be so naive that we think that we're immune to medical marketing. And my first key recommendation is that I think there needs to be a concerted effort to develop training materials, both for our medical residents and for CPD activities that are not sponsored by pharma. My second recommendation is that we find and start looking harder for alternate sources of funding. You know, if you think about a medical journal and there are ads for medications in there, well, the people reading it don't just prescribe medications. You know, physicians have nice cars, they buy watches, they buy nice clothes. There's no reason why we couldn't be sponsored or have advertising for things that are outside of the medical domain, but it would take effort to do that. And then the third recommendation is around the current self-regulating practices. I think that they need to have explicit consequences. I think that things like that disclosure slide need to be better regulated. And that if someone has a disclosure slide with, you know, 100 words on it and says, this is my disclosures and skips it, that we have to accept that that's not acceptable. We need to know who is speaking and where they're coming from. So that's all I had for today. I did list some references in the slides that you can take a look at later, but I think we can go to some questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hazel, Beth Hazel, for that really important and thought-provoking presentation. I think many of us can relate to this. So very important, and thank you for sharing that with us. There are a lot of questions and comments. We're going to see, we have about 12 minutes left, so I'm going to go through some of these questions that are in the chat. Any comment on the book Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime by Danish author Peter Gotze? Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, so there's so much in the literature right now, and I've been talking to people about a bunch of different things. There's Dr. Goldfarb wrote Bad Medicine, a very interesting book. If you guys are Netflix people, I think that watching the story of the Purdue Pharma, I think it's a great story. I'm blanking on the author, Beth something. But there's so much out there, and just like the history of medicine, these are relatively new discussions. So I have not read in detail the Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, but Sergio, if you want to make a comment and tell us why we should all read it, that would be great too.
Before we get that comment, you can. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Sergio. Go ahead.
You can have the book free as PDF. It's amazing because the man, as you may know, he was one of the guys who created the Cochrane review, right, exactly to avoid this type of thing. But the pressure is such that he was kicked out of the Cochrane review, and he couldn't publish in medical journals anymore because of the lawyers were against him. It's worth reading that book. It's amazing.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Sergio. We have quite a few questions here. Wendy Chu is asking, are teaching hospital pharmacies also solicited by drug companies? You know, what's on the formulary? How does that get there? And is there biases there?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert. I don't know, but definitely like we have committees that have doctors on that decide on what new drugs we bring on the formulary. So there have been studies that show that doctors will push to get their drugs to get drugs that they have been marketed to on formulary. But I don't know exactly the process at the MUHC.
How another question here? How credible are drug vaccine trials conducted by pharma as opposed to independent groups? Are comparative analysis of these done?
For vaccine trials, is that what you said?
Yeah, for drug or vaccine trials, are there comparisons in terms of credibility, pharma versus independent, I guess, investigator initiative?
So in the research I did, one of the big issues with pharma trials is not so much the credibility of the evidence, it's the publishing. If you look at the amount of positive papers versus negative papers that are published, there's a lot of varying of negative data. And this became a big issue in some of the antidepressant medications, where a majority of the studies had been negative studies, but the study that they submitted to the FDA was positive for a certain antidepressant. So there's that issue, which I think is limited a little bit now by registering of trials. But there are other studies that, at conferences, industry-sponsored papers are almost 100% positive in their outcomes. So there's that bias, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Maybe you can enter it in the chat afterwards. There's a comment here about McGill-sponsored info for diabetes patients and food supplements. Sometimes we see, even here in our hospital, these kind of signs for things like Ensure or food supplements, and it just feels like people forget that this is also industry-driven. I wonder if you've read up anything about this.
Yeah, exactly, and medical devices too. I mean, it's sales, right? On all different levels. I mean, in the allergy clinic here, they're ads for Downy or I don't know, the detergent that's softer on your skin doesn't cause allergies. All of that's the same thing. It's all marketing.
Eva Siderogis is commenting that their drug reps and samples are not allowed at the MUHC, and that there's continuous vigilance to make sure that we don't have drug reps and samples, even though I think we've all seen some drug reps and some samples on our floor. Should we be a little bit more, strict with that? Any comment about that?
Well, it's we just had our accreditation visit, right, at the MUHC, and so that was one thing that happened when we were preparing our clinic space, that people had to go around and clean up, and there were bags of inappropriate material in our patient rooms. So I think that was a good exercise, but I think it's something that we probably all need to take a look at in our own clinics and see what's going on. And this is within the university institution, right? Those rules aren't even there for physicians practicing in private offices. And I think we get so used to seeing things around that we don't think we're being influenced. But even something as simple as a color stimulus, and I'm sure you can think of drugs that have the advertising has a color association with it in your domain. And in us in the olden days, adalimumab Humira was purple, and there would just be a splash of purple on something, and that would be enough to subconsciously drive your prescribing habit. And that's why things like pens with pharma information on them were banned. Just having those little reminders was enough to change people's prescribing habits. So we really are influenced by things without knowing it.
Absolutely. Mark, you have a comment/question. Do you want to unmute and ask it, Mark? Are you able to?
Yeah, so about 10 or 15 years ago, there was some discussion and push about academic detailing. So, basically the equivalent of drug reps, but they would come from universities and would detail evidence-based medicine. And I guess, one thing that immediately comes up is who's going to pay for this. And I guess my question to you was, did you come across this, and if CPD offices explored this possibility?
So I didn't. That's fascinating. No, I didn't come across that. But then that one of the things I was trying to get to there is, what's the evidence that these clean doctors are going to be presenting. And that's what gets really difficult. If you start, are you presenting the latest guidelines on something? Well, if you dive a little deeper, who made those guidelines and how are they influenced, and those kind of things. If you take something like hypertension or obesity, moving the needle very minimally dramatically increases prescriptions for a drug. And who's pushing that needle? And is it really, the biggest benefit to any drug is in patients that are more severely affected, whether it's depression or hypertension or obesity or rheumatoid arthritis. And so as we're being told, in rheumatoid arthritis, we were pushed to treat to target. As we're being told to treat to a lower and lower target, we have more chance of causing medication side effects. We have more chance of causing harm to our patients, although we may be doing some benefit too. So it's just, I don't know the answer to your question, but I think that this project has made me just a lot more suspicious and made me question at every level who I'm treating and why.
Yes, thank you very much for that. The En Santé magazine that is distributed through the MUHC has all kinds of multicolor color ads from unproven herbal medicines. Any comment about that?
Yeah, marketing works. It doesn't matter what you're marketing, it works. And our patients are consumers, we're consumers, and people are going to advertise to us. Do I think it's better to advertise a herb than a medicine? Probably not. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess that, there's something to be said for that. The herbs are advertising, lots, obviously, without any kind of data, right? And
right.
This is amazing, the number of patients that come in with their bottles of homeopathic herbal type of medications.
And again, a multi-billion-dollar industry, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. There's quite a few more questions and comments, and I think because we're coming up on the hour, I'm going to ask you to look at them, but I would like to ask if you could put your slide, go back to your reference. You had a reference slide there, maybe on, it's kind of hard to see.
Yeah.
See. But, because obviously I can see by all the comments that are coming in, and I'm going to ask you perhaps if you just want to stay on, Beth, a few extra minutes. This has generated obviously a lot of interest and there's a lot of comments, but we will have to close out the chart, the talk here. There's comments on about sponsorship, giving talks, people giving, unconscious biases. What do we do about all these sort of evening lectures that people are giving? And so there's a lot of things to think about. Perhaps also there was mention of some shows, Netflix, anyone in particular did make a mention before I close out the round?
Dopesick was the one that came out there. And I'll just say the caveat, it is dramatized, but it hit home with me because things like the fifth vital sign, pain, that sort of came around in my medical training, and they do a beautiful episode there on how that fifth vital sign, pain, was entirely manufactured by the marketing experts at Purdue Pharma. And just to put this in a real life way, Purdue Pharma won multiple awards for marketing. Like, they're in the marketing hall of fame for some of the things that they managed to do. And we think of it, I see the word sickening there and stuff like that because it was playing with people's lives. But if you think about it from a cold, hard cash kind of way, they found some things that really worked, and things that they did have continued in other domains. So it's tough.
It's tough, definitely. So we will close the rounds. It's just about 1 o'clock. There are comments, a lot of congratulatory comments. Tom Manadia says a few comments here and questions. So I'll ask you, Beth, if you can just stay perhaps on the chat and keep monitoring the chat. It was really, obviously, you can see the interest. This is a talk that obviously spans, the entire Department of Medicine, residents, students, faculty, everyone, staff. So really a great talk to have at Medical Grand Rounds. Thanks for sharing this with us. Good luck finishing your master's.
Thank you.
Once again, if you can stay on, that would be great. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Dr. Hazel, for the wonderful lecture, and I wish everyone a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
So Beth, can you answer that maybe in the chat?
Yeah, about the prescriptions, eh?
Right.
That's really tough because it's through individual pharmacies that the data is obtained, and they're independent. So I looked into it briefly, but I'd have to look and see. Dr. Gruber's right. The IMS used to be able to opt out, but now it seems very complicated to opt out of that.
Now, and what about the faculty being paid by pharma to give talks?
So it's against our McGill policy. Yeah.
It's going on all the time.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
Oh, that's one of the points is that, yeah, I mean, there are ways around the policy as well. You're not allowed to be paid to go to a conference, but according to that policy, they could pay for you to go to the conference, or they could pay for you to give a talk when you came back or something, and the payment would be whatever it cost you to go to that conference, right? So there are sort of ways that people get around these things.
So
one of the things I found,
the restaurant talks, I mean, there's a lot of that.
Yeah, and some of those are very useful. One of the ways around it that some groups are doing is they're trying to get multi-sponsorship. So if you have, a post-national conference rounds for people who didn't get to go to that conference, if you have, 6 different drug companies sponsoring it, is it less biased? It might be, but one of the things that's interesting is that if there's any pharma sponsoring, then there is still that reflex to prescribe a drug versus not prescribe a drug. So, prescribe a drug versus prescribing exercise, weight loss, and not drinking alcohol, or whatever your field is. So it's like I said, it's an ongoing project, and I don't have great answers. I think that the first step is raising awareness that we're being marketed to. We should know we're being marketed to. And I don't think that burying our head in the sand and just not having any relation with industry is the proper answer either, because we need them. We need them to help develop new drugs. We need them. Our conferences won't happen without pharma sponsorship. Like our national conferences are more than 60, 70, 80% pharma sponsored. So we've got this, we're in bed with them. So we have to find a way to live with that.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Have a good afternoon. Take care.